Hello and welcome back. I'm Dominic Shales, publisher of Climate Solutions News. And today we're joined by Adam Fraser, who's chief executive of TerraSet, which is a non-profit channeling philanthropic capital into high quality carbon removal. TerraSet works with donors ranging from foundations to individuals. They've supported many well-known projects like Climeworks, Heirloom, and Planetary, as well as many others in the space, and we'll hear a bit more in a second. Adam's been leading efforts to expand the role of philanthropy in scaling carbon removal and to help provide an alternative to traditional climate investment models. He's also a Brit in America. Adam, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Great to be talking to you.
To kick things off, it would be great if you could maybe just give us a little bit more detail about TerraSet, what you do, some of the projects that you've supported and what you're aiming to achieve.
Yeah, as you said, we are looking to drive philanthropic capital to scale carbon removal. And the reason for that, there are two reasons, in fact. One is carbon removal needs to scale and needs significant capital to do that. And secondly, not nearly enough philanthropic capital goes towards climate causes of any kind, carbon removal or otherwise. We have here a huge market, something like $900 billion a year, of which less than 2% goes to any climate related cause and less than 0.1% to carbon removal, greenhouse gas removal. So we have a big challenge, and then also what we at TerraSet see as an opportunity to move those numbers and see if we can unlock a little more philanthropic capital to help scale carbon removal. That doesn't mean that we think the carbon removal sector should be a philanthropic endeavor. It means that we think philanthropic capital can play a catalytic role in moving it forward, bringing more solutions to market, providing pathways for capital, providing innovative ways that more finance can come into the space. And at the same time, we hope we can get more donors thinking about how to use their dollars to have a positive impact in addressing climate issues.
And obviously, this year is different from last year politically in the US. Have you felt a difference in people's willingness to invest with you and the way that they're looking at kind of capital being used for climate issues?
I think there's been some hesitation this year in our space rather than any sort of pullback. People have at times been waiting to see what happens. We now are coming into Climate Week New York at the time we have this conversation, and there seems to be a real momentum happening again. So my hope is very much that that continues and people uh, feel the urgency of scaling this sector. I'm very confident that carbon removal will scale. I'm very confident we will find answers to many of the things that we need to in addressing the climate crisis. But as you know, and as many people will be well aware, there's a timing issue here, both in terms of scaling this particular piece and in terms of tipping points in the climate and other factors that just mean now is a time to be accelerating this work, not slowing down. And I very much hope that comes through over the next week and in the months ahead.
Very good. And at Climate Solutions News, we spend a lot of our time looking at kind of the technology solutions and necessarily the sort of startups and scale ups working to bring innovation in that space. And you really are doing something a little bit different in terms of the business model and funding early stage startups through this kind of philanthropic approach. Talk to us about that, and how it's different from a traditional kind of equity investor kind of route that we're all so used to.
It's different to an equity investor route, and it's also different to how a lot of nonprofits, charities, 501(c)(3)s, as they're known in the US, might address this work, because we're not generally giving grants and we're not funding research and development, and we're not doing all the other amazing things that philanthropic capital can do. We're generally acting as a buyer of carbon removal, and we are pre-purchasing carbon removal. So we raise money from high net worth individuals, family offices, foundations, other sources of philanthropic capital. And then we use that money to make strategic pre-purchases of engineered carbon removal from some of the companies you mentioned, a portfolio of around 22 companies at the moment. And we do that because we think that those pre-purchases can be very catalytic. They move money to these solutions at a time when they're needed, and capital is not always easy to come by. They act as a reference point for other buyers. They are revenue on a balance sheet, which makes companies more attractive to investors, which can make debt finance easier to secure. There are a lot of reasons that we believe being revenue on a balance sheet is powerful. And we pre-purchase, so we pay up front for carbon that will be delivered later, because we believe that that's the most catalytic way to move that money. And some of our suppliers have said to us that they consider dollar for dollar a pre-purchase as around 25 to 30% more valuable than an offtake agreement after you've financed the offtake agreement. Obviously, offtake agreements are incredibly valuable in scaling the space as well, but we believe that pre-purchases are how we can best use this philanthropic capital to make a difference.
And how do you evaluate the projects before you do those pre-purchase agreements?
Yeah, we have a vetting system, a due diligence system that is looking at analyzing the projects across a range of criteria you'd be very familiar with in this space. That the solution, the carbon removal, is scalable and it's validated and it's catalytic and it's additional, etc. We have an application process where companies come to us, a scoring system where they are assessed. We have advisory boards feeding into both our overall strategic portfolio makeup and particular questions that might arise. You know, if we need an ocean scientist to look at something in particular, in another case, that might be someone who's got more experience on the finance side of what a company is looking to build. But we use all of those to then make the decisions we put to our board and say, this is a purchase we recommend from our portfolio. It's really important because, you know, as you know, donors care about rigor. They want to know that if they are giving money to something, it's going to be impactful. You know, that's kind of more the case with philanthropic giving than anything else. Like if we give money to a charitable cause, we want to know it's going to have an impact, whatever that cause is. And so we take very seriously trying to make sure that the solutions that we're backing are ones that will have an impact. But I will say we're also aware that there's risk in this space. Not every carbon removal company that's looks really good now is necessarily going to scale and grow and reach where it could be. Like that's just the reality of a new sector emerging, and that's what happens in every new sector emerging. So again, it's a reason that we can be somewhat risk tolerant with our capital without giving up on the rigor and due diligence that our donors would want to see.
Yeah, and how do you address, I mean, because there is a lot of inbuilt skepticism in certain areas about sort of carbon removal and, you know, offsets and, this whole area really that came from a few bad actors early on in the process. You know, are you finding that people have moved away from that skepticism to some extent, or, you know, how are you dealing with that?
I think I'd maybe answer in a couple of ways. So the first is that issues that have arisen in the past in the voluntary carbon market, we believe will drive a flight to quality. You know, people will want to make sure that they're getting what they paid for. And we believe that carbon removal versus some, let's say, older, more traditional forms of offsetting carbon is more measurable, more provable, and gives people that security. The second thing is that I was at the Carbon Removal Alliance's member retreat a while ago, and they were a few weeks ago, and they were looking at some statistics around awareness and policy of carbon removal. And it really became apparent to me that what we have is an awareness problem rather than a skepticism problem. You know, once people actually understand carbon removal and are aware of it, the statistics in terms of people supporting it are very high. The problem is most people don't know what carbon removal is. They've never heard of it, or if they have, it's a throwaway line in a wider piece they're reading. And so I think those of us in the space and trying to grow it have a real responsibility to think about the actual awareness of this work as much as anything else.
Which is a great prompt to ask you to talk about a couple of the projects that you're you're working with. But maybe choose a couple of the lesser known ones that you've invested in lately, and what do they do? How do they work? How are you tracking it?
Yeah, it's a great question to put me on the spot with, because it's a bit of a choose your favorite child question. Um, we have such a range of amazing methodologies, companies, geographies. We have deliberately tried to build a diverse portfolio that's bringing different carbon removal solutions to to the field. So, many people who think about carbon removal will often think about direct air capture and think, here's a big fan sucking in air, binding the molecules to this substance, and therefore taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Which, that's my general summary of how people think about direct air capture. We are funding direct air capture organizations, some very well-known ones, but we're also really looking at those who are thinking about it in a slightly different way. So a couple of examples of that, just because they're at opposite ends of the temperature scale. We are really proud to work with Octavia Carbon in Kenya. They were Africa's first direct air capture company. They're trying to really build on the natural resources that exist in Kenya, where there's an abundance of geothermal energy, there's an abundance of wind energy, or a potential abundance of it, to be able to do DAC at a really low cost. To be able to do DAC at a really low cost. At the same time, we're working with an organization called TerraFixing in Canada. They're very focused on cold weather direct air capture, so trying to make this work in the frozen north. And I think both of those things show the different extremes at which this work can happen. There are also organizations where we really care deeply about the wider impact they're having beyond carbon removal. Octavia are creating jobs and livelihoods and building a whole new sector in sub-Saharan Africa. TerraFixing are working closely with indigenous communities around the renewable energy powering their work. So just a couple of examples of even with direct air capture as a methodology people might be most familiar with, there are a lot of variations. We have Carbon Run, who work by essentially adding limestone to rivers so that draws in more carbon. We have companies focused on microbial mineralization so that soil takes up more greenhouse gases. A real range of methodologies that we need all of these to scale, and all of them to reach the point that we're taking the necessary amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere in the years to come.
I mean, it's a fascinating range. It really is. And so, widespread in terms of geographies as well. What's the process for finding the projects in the first place? How do you approach them? Do they apply for funding through a certain, process that you've got? Tell us a little bit more about that.
It's very much been inbound interest. So we do get amazing referrals from people who say, I've seen this great project or this great solution. But we have, I mentioned before, been able to purchase from 22 different companies. We've had well over 200 come to us for funding. We're capital constrained. I wish we had the money to purchase carbon from far more organizations than we've been able to do so far. We have an open intake form on our website, so people can go and complete that anytime and get into our system and start that first stage of assessment and looking at where they fit. That's deliberately light touch, because we want people to not have to spend a huge amount of time just to sort of get into the process and get into the system. So that lets us do an initial look at things, and then from there, as I mentioned before, we're looking at a lot of different factors. We're looking at advice from our Carbon Council, who are the advisory board, looking at portfolio makeup. We're looking at whether there are particular restrictions on funding we have available. For example, if a donor say, I really want to support projects in North America, I really want to support projects in Africa. We're looking at all of those factors, and we're looking at portfolio diversity as well. We were a year ago probably quite heavy on direct air capture, so we deliberately focused on bringing some other methodologies into the portfolio, and that will continue as we raise more money and expand the portfolio. We'll continue to bring different solutions to scale or play a small role in bringing those different solutions to scale.
And when you're dealing with donors, either individuals or the sort of other large foundations, what are they pushing you most on? Is it actually the quantum of carbon that is going to be taken out? Is that the most important thing for them, or are there other considerations?
I would say they have a range of motivations. You can maybe group it across three different areas, and then there's crossover between those. There are people who care very much about the quantum of carbon, as you said. They want to know this many tons of CO2 are no longer going to be in the atmosphere because of my donation, and that might be because they're thinking about their own personal footprint or their organizational footprint. It might just be because that's where they see the potential to make a difference. The second group of people who are less concerned about that and more concerned about with how the sector scales. And they're thinking, my money now can help grow this sector 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. The ton of carbon purchased now is more impactful than a ton of carbon purchased later because we need to go on that journey. And that's important because if you were only thinking about the quantum, if you were only thinking about the number of tons, you gravitate towards the lowest cost things. And that's not what we want to happen. We want to have some things in our portfolio that cost more money now, but have the potential to be far more competitive on price later as they scale. And then the third group is those who are thinking about the co-benefits, those who are thinking about a particular mission aligned area that's not pure carbon removal. So we've talked to family offices who really care about river quality. And I mentioned Carbon Run before, who are looking at that. We've talked to people who really care about wildfire prevention, and they see some of the biomass focused carbon removal solutions as a way of reducing wildfire risk. And I think where carbon removal can plug into those other areas or plug into existing systems is where we'll really see some rapid scaling in the next couple of years.
And what scale of investment or purchases have you made to date, and what kind of is the level of fundraising that you're doing into your organization on a yearly basis at the moment?
Yeah, it's been a real time of growth. We only launched the organization a couple of years ago. In that time, we've now raised the best part of $10 million and hoping to really accelerate that because in some ways we can feel good about raising that money from, coming from let's say a standing start. But it's a drop in the bucket of what's actually going to be needed. And even though I said philanthropy will only be a drop in the bucket of the bigger picture, the role it has is critical. So we need to keep pushing that and doing more. When we have deployed that, it's been really across a range of things, depending on a range of sizes of check, depending on what the company needs. And I think what's really interesting in this field is that sometimes a smaller purchase from the right organization can be more impactful than a larger purchase elsewhere. So we have companies where we've gone and purchased $1 million plus of carbon removal. We also have companies where the check size was something more like $50,000. But for the stage of the company and where they were, that's been really impactful. It's led to follow-on funding from other people. It's allowed them to move forward. So we go into it with an open mind. We don't say we will only make purchases between this amount and this amount. We don't say we'll only make purchases between this price per ton and this amount. We're really looking for how can this be catalytic and how can we move this money and actually make a difference for those companies.
And what's your plan for the next stage?
We need to scale, right? The whole sector needs to scale. We need to scale. We need to bring more money in. So we, as an organization, have to think about what does that mean? It does not necessarily just mean adding more companies to a portfolio, moving more money. It means thinking about how can we be more innovative with the money we have. The Schmidt Family Foundation backed us earlier this year to launch a revolving fund where we use their philanthropic capital to pre-purchase carbon, but once the tons are delivered, we try to resell those to corporate buyers and then use the money that comes in from that to pre-purchase more carbon. So we kind of keep the flywheel spinning with future pre-purchases. We also want to think about different impact areas. Carbon removal is a huge part of the solution, but it's certainly not the only part of the solution, as you know. So we're really thinking about, what's our role? What are the lessons from our model that could be applied to methane abatement, that could be applied to refrigerant destruction? And we've done a lot of pilot work in those areas. So between those different funding mechanisms and those different impact areas are where I see us continuing to try to innovate, as well as continuing to move more money to the carbon removal itself, and both our existing portfolio and as it expands.
And what's the role of government with you and in the carbon removal space, do you think?
I mean, ultimately, this space needs to exist at a scale that it requires government involvement, it requires regulation, it requires policy. From our side of things, we have deliberately not set TerraSet up to be a policy-focused organization. There are other people in countries around the world doing amazing policy work. Carbon 180 and the Carbon Removal Alliance here in the States, and Carbon Removal Canada, and Carbon Gap, Green Finance Institute, like lots of people around the world really putting in great work to move this forward. It's an interesting thing because this is a global problem, and you get alignment between governments, but obviously policy usually comes in on a national basis. And that's going to look really different in different places. Different governments will take different approaches to what needs to be regulated, to what needs to be compulsory, to what needs to be encouraged, to what needs to be incentivized by tax credits, all those different things. But it's all a critical part of the mix.
Fantastic. And just to finish off, and give yourself a little plug, what's the website where people can get in touch, whether they're donors with large checks or startups wanting large checks?
Let's say also donors with small checks. You can go to our website and you can donate $10. You can donate $20. Now, if you are someone who wants to come and donate $1 million, that's very welcome. But I think we believe that everyone can play a role in this, and that's important. Our website is terrasetclimate.org, and we try and be very transparent on there about what we're doing and the decisions we're making. So there's a lot of material there where people can dig in and find out more about us, and we really welcome.
Big thank you to Adam Fraser, who's Chief Executive of TerraSet. I find it fascinating how philanthropy can, step in and accelerate carbon removal technologies. It's a different way of thinking about the funding problem. And I'm sure that startup companies will welcome you with open arms to get prepayment on carbon removal, rather than wait for those offset agreements or kind of equity investments, which can take a long time and lots of effort. So thanks very much, and do stay tuned for further Climate Solutions News podcasts.
Thank you, Dominic.